As we have previously covered on Words and Coffee, New Jersey has long been a booming place for those that made booms. Even before it was in the starting lineup for the back-to-back World War Championship team, and before it would participate in a lot of mucking around in Central and South America, that never gets mentioned, America had a training camp with itself. Following the Civil War, the Army did some soul-searching and asked, how come the Navy gets all the beachfront property? And so the brass staked out some prime real estate on the Jersey Shore within sight of New York City. Now, kind of funny for a state that only legalized fireworks in 2015, but the Sandy Hook Proving Grounds would go on to support research, development, and testing for all manner of explosives. It just goes to show that such things can be done safely. For the most part. Welcome to Words and Coffee, where we talk interesting history about the Garden State and showcase a bag of small batch roasted goodness. Today's brew is Direct Action by Stocking Mill Coffee. And the history is the Sandy Hook Proving Ground and the accidental sinking of the schooner Henry R. Tilton. Let's get to it. In 1874, the Army Ordnance Department got their hands on a wonderful piece of prime real estate. With frontage on both the open ocean and the protected bay, this sandy little patch of heaven was appropriately named Sandy Hook, and undoubtedly could have hosted hotels, amusement parks, and all manner of money-making machines. So of course the government turned it into a bomb range. In truth, I couldn't find an answer for why they made this frankly baffling decision, but I can think of a couple reasons. Number one, it's easier to shoot into the water. Think about it. Nice long distance without the attendant real estate prices, easy access to transport by boat, and if you get a dud, no need to call EOD, just a convenient burial at sea. You also need to keep in mind the context of the time. The Brits had occupied New York within the last 100 years. The Navy fired gunnery on rioters just 11 years earlier. It stood to reason that something might kick off in that region again, so the government was happy to keep some big guns around. Just in case. It's also a straight run from the Army gun factory at Waterfleet Arsenal down the Hudson River to Sandy Hook. Big guns need to be tested, and so does the ammo, much of which was being produced at Picatinny Arsenal and the Kenville Powder Plant, a relatively short train ride away. Thus, Sandy Hook quickly grew to include all test-firing operations. This included experimental design and development of gun carriages, as well as the chemistry of propellant. Now, when it comes to artillery and gunnery, there's a lot of work on the back end to make sure the appropriate warheads arrive on their designated foreheads. Different propellant mixtures, new fuse types, cannon proofing, it all needs to be characterized and the data collected. You blow some stuff up on the beach, you're a danger to society. You wear a lab coat and write it down, you're a scientist. In the 15 years since its founding, the Proving Grounds went through the attendant growing pains and expansions for any new operation until it became a city unto itself. While the 1880s would bear witness to several accidents and a number of fatalities, following that, safety would be considered with greater scrutiny. However, that scrutiny largely applied to the onshore operations. Considerably less attention was given to those on the water, and accidents still happen. Next, we meet a three-masted schooner named the Henry R. Tilton, named for the Civil War Army surgeon and Jersey boy of the same name. Colonel Tilton was born in Barnegat, New Jersey, and would have a storied career. Among his many achievements, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The keel for his namesake was laid down in Wilmington, Delaware in the latter part of 1874, built of oak and pine. 152 feet long, 468 long tons, her primary job was coastal trade, transporting coal, lumber, and rock between American ports. On this voyage, the Tilton, under command of Frank E. Harris, was on its way to Philadelphia to execute a contract for coal delivery, a trip which the crew of 7 had made twice already. The morning of July 9, 1892, they had just been towed by tugboat past Governor's Island and were leaving New York Harbor, and prepared to continue their voyage under sail. They made it as far as Sandy Hook, and there the voyage was suddenly and violently interrupted. This is one of those things that in hindsight was pretty obviously an issue. Oh, so you bought some prime coastal real estate and turned it into a gun range. Oh, and you put it right next to one of the busiest ports in the world? What could go wrong there? But of course, we get ahead of ourselves. On July 9th, the proving grounds were recording muzzle velocity data for a new propellant formula from a little mom and pop operation you might have heard of called DuPont. This was the bread and butter for the proving grounds. They record the resulting velocity for the propellant type, mass, projectile weight, and from there they can calculate firing tables. This gets real exciting when they try to dial in the optimum propellant mass and the gun explodes, something that happened with some frequency in the decade leading up to the Tilton accident. However, on this day, things had mostly gone off without a hitch. Mostly. They were firing southward, and to be clear, this wasn't willy-nilly into a crowded shipping lane. They were firing near shore with the projectiles impacting solid sand butts. That is, a large berm used to safely control the terminal end of things. See, they did think about this stuff. The test stand was a disappearing carriage type, mounting a 10-inch gun tube and firing a 600-pound projectile. For comparison, a modern 155 is about 100 pounds. I always find it interesting the little developmental rabbit holes the military sometimes goes down. The idea here was that you'd have four guys fighting from behind a wall like a medieval castle. They'd load the gun while safely on the ground, then raise it up to shoot over the top of the wall, and the recoil would be absorbed through the motion of bringing it back down to ground level, and so on. Nothing really to do with the story here, but it's just like, didn't think you could just shoot up and over it, huh? Since this was a propellant test, the projectiles were inert. For reasons that should be obvious by now, this was extremely fortuitous. To be fair, the ground crew did see the Tilton, sailing south nearly 2 miles offshore, but figured they were far enough out of the firing line to be safe. And normally they would have been correct. They fired once, it smacked the butt, and everything was fine. But then came the second shot. Upon slapping the butt, okay, that's the last one, I promise. Upon slapping the butt, the inert shell did a ricochet, flying out into the ocean almost sideways, cartwheeling through the air. Now, just for a sense of scale, here's Sandy Hook, here's approximately where the Tilton would have been, and here's about how big it was. Come on. The shell made impact in the Tilton stern on the starboard side about 8 feet above the waterline. It then proceeded to pass through the ship at a diagonal, exiting below the waterline on the port side. That wasn't good. First mate Charles Gose reported a terrific blow that shook the ship from stem to stern and broke the decks with a tremendous crash. The impact had been a through and through. Now, if this wasn't already the luckiest of lucky shots, the crew was completely unharmed. I mean, except for the fact their boat was sinking. That was not good. And it was happening like really fast. The ship had been under a port tack with a close hull, meaning it was riding the wind and leaning to the right, a lean which steadily increased as she took on water. Thankfully, Frank Harris acted quickly and ordered his men into the lifeboat and got everyone to safety. Unfortunately, all personal effects went down with the ship, which then capsized. A total loss. The crew floated until they were rescued by a nearby steamship, who towed them back to New York. Meanwhile, the boys at Sandy Hook had no idea anything was amiss. Like, oh, yikes, wonder where that one went. Oh, well, load her up. Where's my dip? It wasn't until they saw the steamship towing the lifeboat that anyone thought to ask, guys, what happened to the sailboat? But that wasn't the end of it. See, the schooner had been abandoned, because it sank. It was fair game, legally speaking. Thus, just a couple hours later, the tugboats, Babcock and Hohen, arrived on scene to try and pull her away. The westerly wind had carried the capsized vessel into the shallows where it had gone aground, so they tried to drag it out into slightly deeper water. They were soon joined by the Vosburg and the Protector. The steam tugs, hoping to get salvage rights, had a few things going in their favor. The water was relatively shallow, and the ship, while sideways, was still sort of floating. This would result in a bit of a dispute later when the vessels Walcott and Veet had trouble moving the Tilton, and it was only with the assistance of the W.E. Chapman and the Derrick Reliance that the schooner was successfully towed to the Gravesend Bay near Bath Beach in Brooklyn. There's like 8 ships involved. The Tilton was sold, as is, on the 29th of July. No tire kickers, I know what I got. Not even 3 weeks from the time of her sinking. After the relatively minor damage was repaired, she would go on to serve several more years as a transport vessel. Later, she would survive the Portland Gale off the coast of New Hampshire in 1898, beached in the luckiest of lucky spots, shown here, in a storm which claimed 140 other vessels. But ultimately, her luck would run out, and she would be lost off Cape Cod in 1912. Back in Jersey, the Secretary of War, as the SecDef was known at the time, was on the hook for the fair value of the Tilton and personal effects lost. I'm just kidding, he didn't pay a dime. As always, it was funded by the taxpayers, because, as old Ronnie once said,
the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
Eventually, the Sandy Hook Proving Grounds would close shop in Jersey and relocate to Aberdeen, Maryland, where it remains to this day. Today, the site at Sandy Hook is still partly owned by the Coast Guard, which, actually makes sense, and the rest of it has been turned into a national recreation area. Many of the old gun positions are still there and open to the public. Just don't go digging in the sand. Trust me. That'll about do it for me. If you stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching. Sources in the description as usual. This has been Words and Coffee. Until next time.